Okay, so now we're going to talk about our parasites that are going to be important for intestinal and urogenital diseases with respect to the group called Protozoa. And so we're going to discuss some of our famous protozoas, our Entamoeba histolytica, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, which is Lamblia also, and then Trichomonas Vaginalis. Now, some interesting facts about these guys are that Entamoeba histolytica is the most common amoeba associated with diarrheal disease. So if you're talking about amoeboid dysentery, it is only Entamoeba histolytica that you can be talking about. So that term is specific for this particular parasite. Now, Cryptosporidium is the most common cause of waterborne outbreaks of our enterocolitis, and this is inflammation of the small intestine and colon. Giardia duodenus is the most common flagella that's responsible for diarrheal disease. And Trichomonas vaginalis is going to be responsible for vaginitis, and it is a sexually transmitted disease. Now, our intestinal protozoa are going to be, again, in these three categories. We have our amoeba, which is Entamoeba histolytica, coccidia, Cryptosporidium, and our flagellate, Giardia and Trichomonas. Now, Entamoeba histolytica is, again, going to have cyst and trophozoite. The trophozoite, again, is the feeding stage, the mobile stage, the almost living stage. And both cyst and trophozoites can be diagnostic for this. They're both going to be found in the stool specimens. The trophozoite is not the transmitted form. It is the cyst that is the transmitted form. Right, so the cyst gets ingested, and the acid stomach stimulates the release of the trophozoites into the small intestine. So the trophozoite itself would be neutralized by the acid, but the cyst is activated by the acid in the stomach. And then the trophozoites are going to be released, and they have within them a cytotoxin that's going to damage cells and tissue. They are going to form what are called flask-shaped ulcers in the intestinal mucosa. And so here's the life cycle. So again, we have our cyst and trophozoites that are excreted. The trophozoite is going to die in the environment. It's not going to survive. The cyst is going to be transmitted. It gets eaten, ingested. And then once it hits the intestine, you're going to have the cyst turn into a trophozoite. The trophozoite is going to use a cytotoxin to invade the colon, and then it's going to multiply. And then you can form those ulcers in the intestine. It can also disseminate into other areas of the body, or it can be released as cysts or trophozoites in your stool sample. Now, Entamoeba histolytica is going to be found worldwide. It's going to be common in subtropical and tropical areas. Typically, it's associated with poor hygiene. It's fecal-oral type of transmission. Asymptomatic carriers are going to be the reservoirs for the disease, so they don't even know they have it. And the trophozoites are going to like to replicate in the lumen of the colon. And again, this is going to be fecal-oral water-food transmission, as well as oral and anus sex. And this is just a picture of your cyst. Now again, we're going to have transmission via those asymptomatic carriers primarily. They're going to keep everything going. You have intestinal amoebiasis, which is going to be infection of the colon, abdominal pain, cramping. Extraintestinal amoebiasis is going to be dissemination in the liver primarily, but it could also be in the lungs. And then you can also see in a biopsy these flask-shaped ulcers within the mucosal lining. Diagnosis is going to be trophozoites and cyst in the stool. There are also, of course, nucleic acid amplification tests, similar to PCR. Extraintestinal amoebiasis is going to be through antibodies, serology. The treatment is going to be with metronidazole and paromycin. And then prevention, of course, is sanitation, use of chlorine, and filtration in water systems. The next guy is Cryptosporidium. Cryptosporidium is going to have an oocyst in the feces, so this is not a trophozoite. And so the oocyst is going to be diagnostic, and it's also going to be transmission. So the oocyst with sporozoites, when it's mature, can be ingested and then can keep this going. This guy likes to replicate in the brush border, and then large outbreaks are associated when drinking or recreational water is contaminated. Your clinical disease, again, our asymptomatic carriers are going to be important in the transmission of this. You can also have some mild diarrheal disease, which can be self-limiting. Enterocolitis can occur, and this is going to occur about 10 days in an immune-competent patient. And then an immune-compromised patient, similar to our fungal infections, these are going to lead to severe enterocolitis. Diagnosis is going to be those oocysts in the stools. And also you can use immunoassays or those nucleic amplification tests. You have different treatments, whether you're immune competent or immune compromised. So immune compromised is going to be the paromycin plus azithromycin, and then immune competent is the nitazoxanide. Prevention, again, goes back to sanitary conditions. Giardia is going to be a flagellate, so we have these little flagella. It looks kind of like a funny little organism. This is also termed Lamblia or Intestinalis. It's all the same organism, whether it's Giardia duodenalis, Giardia Lamblia, Giardia intestinalis. The ingestion of the cyst, in this case, is going to be infectious. And then the gastric acid, again, is going to stimulate the release of the trophozoites. So in that aspect, it is similar to Entamoeba histolytica. And remember, Entamoeba histolytica also has cyst forms. And so Giardia and Entamoeba histolytica both have cysts. And then the same thing that happened with Entamoeba, in this case, the trophozoite is going to disintegrate with Giardia. Now, the ingestion of cysts with arminid has a very low minimum infectious dose of only 10 to 25, so they're highly contagious. And then again, the gastric acid will release the trophozoites. The organisms are going to replicate by binary fission, and then they have a sucking disc that will allow them to attach to the intestinal microvillus cells. This is going to cause inflammation, and they're mostly going to stay in the gastrointestinal tract. They rarely disseminate. So this one is going to be worldwide. In this case, wild animals are an important reservoir. Asymptomatic humans also are carriers, are another important reservoir. There are only going to be two forms of this. We have our infectious cysts and our replicating trophozoites. The humans are going to have to take in the cyst. Person-to-person spread is via fecal to oral, and so this is going to be associated with areas where you have close contact, non-sanitary conditions, children, nurseries, daycares, etc. are going to have outbreaks of this guy. The clinical disease for Giardia is simply mostly an asymptomatic carrier. You can have giardiasis of the small intestine, which is going to be diarrhea, or having some sort of malnutrition, malabsorption syndrome. The incubation period for this is going to be 10 days, and this has a very onset sudden foul-smelling watery diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and flatulence. And then this is going to be persistent for about 1 to 2 weeks and will be cleared, or you could develop a chronic disease. And here is a picture of our little trophozoite. Diagnosis is going to be with your detection of trophozoites and cysts. You can also, again, have nucleic acid test available. We have an azole that's going to be available for treatment. And again, you're going to avoid contaminated water. The cyst for our Giardia is resistant to chlorine. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Resistant to chlorine. And so in this case, you have to boil or filter the water in order to get rid of the cysts. Now for our urogenital protozoa, we have Trichomonas Vaginalis, which is very important. This one has 4 flagella, so you can see the little flagella, and they're polarized. They're on one side. This is going to be worldwide. Our Trichomonas is only a trophozoite, has no cyst form, and so that's very different than the ones we've just been talking about. So this is going to be found in vaginal tissue of women and urethras, as well as urethras and prostates of men. So person-to-person transmission occurs through sexual intercourse. So this is one of them that doesn't have a cyst, so it can't survive outside. So it has to be person-to-person transmission. Most infected, again, are going to be asymptomatic. You don't know you have it. You can have inflammation in your vaginal area, burning, itching, and then without treatment, this can persist for months or years. Diagnosis is going to be detection of the parasite. Again, no cyst. So it's that trophozoite by microscopic examination. A diazole, metronidazole is the treatment. And it's important to treat both sexual partners because, again, it's going to be able to be transmitted again and again and again unless you get both partners clear of this particular parasite.